myself and the director in the room, and I was like, well, this will be a private presentation. I think in person. And literally within 5 minutes, boats started arriving at the docks and cars started pouring in, and we ended up with a crowd about this size. And it was just shocking to me that everybody showed up in the last minute, and then we had people docking boats to come listen to a presentation. So it's one of those cool experiences, and I've tried to make this a tradition since then to present here. Today I'm going to talk about moose. It's one of my favorite species. And what I like about this presentation and this particular timing is I'm going to talk about Indigenous co-stewardship, which is how tribal nations in North America co-steward species and lands for the benefit of the whole U.S. population. And the timing is interesting. The Grand Portage Rendezvous and Powwow is also this weekend, so I thought this is kind of a neat weekend to give this presentation. Has anybody here been to the powwow this weekend?
Or not this weekend.
But been to the powwow in the past? Okay, cool. So it sounds like many of the folks have done it. That's great. I actually didn't go this year yet because I tend to avoid crowds. We'll start at the end and then we'll go to the beginning, I guess. You know, some of the take-home messages that I'd like to convey are that Indigenous people have had an historic and presently expanding role in landscape protection, stewardship, and management. And a lot of this stems from the fact that tribes have treaties and pre-existing agreements with federal governments that support co-management and Indigenous stewardship. And I'll talk a little bit about treaties and how they work with regard to tribal nations in the U.S. as well. Traditional ecological knowledge has been successfully used for eons to support landscapes. And we're in this new era, which I'll talk about, where modern governments are increasingly recognizing and relying on the role of Indigenous people to maintain healthy ecosystems. And it makes, someone in my role feel very fulfilled to be able to work actively on landscape protection and natural resources management with a culture that values that as highly as Indigenous nations do. So most people here, who here is not from Minnesota? We've got a couple folks. Huh, great. Okay, so most people know where Grand Portage is that are from Minnesota, but it's right on the border of Lake Superior, or on the shore of Lake Superior, on the border of Ontario and Minnesota, and it's a happy place, obviously.
I was real happy when they swam there this week.
Yes. So I was on that rescue. I also do search and rescue, and I'm an ambulance driver for the tribe. And I just call him the guy Michael Phelps. Yeah. But we get a handful of rescues every year. And in fact, we're building the first ever Indigenous Coast Guard. We have 4 search and rescue vessels in construction currently. 2 will stay in Grand Portage. I'll use one of them for some environmental education programming as well as search and rescue. And then one we are giving to Cook County for search and rescue, and one we're giving to Lake County for search and rescue. So kind of cool. I don't know how we got on that subject. Oh, because Michael Phelps swimming. So the Grand Portage Band, I never know what I'm going to say in presentations. And you guys can exacerbate that if you choose to. The Grand Portage Band signed a treaty in 1854 with the federal government. And in that treaty, the Grand Portage Band ceded about 5 million acres of northeastern Minnesota, indicated by this red in the 1854. That's called the 1854 ceded territory. In allowing the federal government to use that land for various purposes, the band also negotiated that they would be able to hunt, fish, and gather on that 5 million acres of northeastern Minnesota into perpetuity. This is a property right that goes along with the land, and if anybody is familiar with severed mineral rights from surface rights, this is precisely that type of right. So the Grand Portage's right to hunt, fish, and gather in the 54 ceded territory lasts forever. It's a property right very much like a mineral right, but it also justifies positions like mine where part of my job is to ensure that there is something that can be hunted, fished, and gathered in the 1854 ceded territory. The Grand Portage Reservation itself is largely undeveloped. It's about 70 square miles of mostly wilderness. There are 3 gravel roads that traverse the reservation. There's Highway 61, and there are about 250 or 300 residences on the reservation. My job is fascinating to me because I'm trained in Western science. I'm trained in fishery science primarily and wildlife science secondarily. But the job that I get to do merges Western science with Ojibwa culture and Ojibwa worldview, and I find that extremely rewarding. Ojibwa culture really parallels a Western science terminology called ecosystem health. But in Ojibwa culture, we do things called seventh generation planning. Seventh generation planning is based on this philosophy that every individual is touched by 7 generations from a great-grandparent to a great-grandchild. But not only are you touched by 7 generations, there's a burden of responsibility that we are to leave this planet in the manner that our great-grandchildren 7 generations forward can use it the same way that we use it now. If this were a commonplace mindset in North American modern society, I probably wouldn't have a job because there wouldn't be a need for such a job. If you contrast this philosophy with a more modern philosophy of manifest destiny, where this idea has been perpetuated that the earth was put in place for humans to use as they see fit and to produce as they see fit and to develop as they see fit. There's a stark philosophical difference. And I really think, at least for someone like me, this 7th generation planning type of approach is probably a healthier approach if we do want to perpetuate humanity for the next few generations. Also in the Chippewa worldview, there is this idea of a oneness of nature and humanity. And more recently, I've heard tribal elected leaders in conversations with the federal government and state legislators and federal legislators argue that tribes represent those that can't speak, which is essentially the four-legged creatures and the winged creatures and the plants and the trees. And I thought that was very powerful. I heard that probably 15 years ago from an elected leader, and that really struck me, because if you hear the conversations that tribal elected leaders have with either heads of federal agencies or political appointees or legislators, they are very philosophical types of conversations. They are not technical conversations, and they really sort of insist on the moral obligation to do the right thing, which is really fascinating to watch, and it's very powerful to watch as well. And then I talked a little bit about treaty rights and reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather. But if you think about these reserved rights on this as a property right on a huge piece of land, when one has a right to hunt, fish, and gather something, that is hunted, fished, and gathered has to be consumable, right? So if the mercury levels in fish are so high that people should not consume them, that right to gather that species has been abrogated by whomever allowed mercury levels to get to that level. So this gives tribes some power in negotiating with the state and the federal agencies that have obligations to protect the environment from things like pollution. It's going to be a long talk if I spend this much time on each slide. Well, I'll pick up the pacing somehow, but I definitely have a philosophical bent to how I like to communicate. So the tribes in northeastern Minnesota, as I mentioned, Grand Portage Band, the Fond du Lac Band, and the Bois Forte Band all signed this treaty of 1854, allowing for this piece of land to be hunted, fished, and gathered on by those 3 tribes. And if you look at Core Moose Range in Minnesota, all of Core Moose Range is housed within the 1854 ceded territory. So preserving those resources that the rights are based on is really key to preserving these cultural practices and subsistence lifeways. And moose, this is the Ojibwa spelling for moose. They pronounce it moose. If you look at my license plate outside, it's moose doctor. That's pretty much what I do for a living. But moose are one of the most important subsistence species for the tribes, and that's what I really spend a lot of my time and energy focusing on. So the types of things I do in my position as a tribal natural resources director is I really work on applied research questions. how can we potentially mitigate the effects of climate change on subsistence species? Or what is causing the moose population decline in Minnesota? And more importantly, what can we do to address this? Or I study contaminants quite a bit, and I look at, are contaminants in the environment affecting the sustainability of subsistence species? I have a whole presentation showing the high levels of pharmaceuticals that we find in Minnesota water bodies, even undeveloped ones, and the high levels of pharmaceuticals that we find in fish tissues. Most of the pharmaceuticals that we find are either hormones or antidepressants, both of which affect reproduction and behaviors of fish in very similar ways that they affect behaviors of humans. Interestingly enough, fish, because they're swimming in a cocktail of these pharmaceuticals and respiring with their gills with a very high amount of surface area, are actually achieving a human level dose of these pharmaceuticals, even though the pharmaceuticals are only found at parts per trillion levels in the water. So that's another day and another presentation. So I spend a lot of time and energy working on moose, and Grand Portage was the second tribe in the nation to develop a climate adaptation plan, a strategic plan to adapt to climate change, and that was assigned to me in 2008, and it took me about 5 years to do that. But one of the cool things about our climate adaptation plan is that we have objective thresholds in the plan itself on how we're going to manage various species. So for example, if the moose population on the Grand Portage Reservation is greater than 60, we consider that healthy and self-sustaining, and we won't really do anything. If the moose population falls between greater than 10 and less than 60 animals, this is our active restoration and research phase. And that's the phase that we've been in for the last 15 years or so. But if we get to a point where the moose population drops to fewer than 10 on the reservation for greater than 5 years, it may not be worth extensive time and energy and financial resources to keep trying to restore something that is destined to fail. I hope we don't get to that point, but that's the reality of it. And these thresholds are really cool aspects of our adaptation planning, I think. So that's what I talked about.
That's what area that 60 is? You said in reservation. Is it?
Yes, on the reservation. So not the whole ceded territory, just the reservation itself. Let me click back a couple. See if I got an image of just the res. So here's the reservation. Oops, I forgot that point.
Okay,
here's the reservation itself. So it's about 70 square miles.
Okay.
For the whole ceded territory, we're looking at around 4,000 moose, give or take.
Thank you.
Yeah, also, everyone can feel free to ask questions or interject conversation. I enjoy that. It makes presentations more interesting for me, because otherwise it's just me monologuing, and I spend most of my time doing that at the house. Okay, yeah. All these images are images I took. I really like moose, and I like to do wildlife photography simultaneously, so I have some nice images. We started doing a collaring program on moose in 2010 in Grand Portage, and over that time frame, we've now collared more than 500 moose. This is the self-promotion slide. It's the only one. We've now collared more than 500 moose. We're collaborating with several agencies in doing so. We've produced around 30 peer-reviewed publications on moose and the related ecosystem. I've worked on 3 different documentaries, including Nature, or PBS Nature, a couple other ones. There's one underway right now, a couple of British guys. I think it's going to be really good. We spent 2.5 years filming it. They want to produce it and get it to the United Nations Climate Summit. So I appreciate the fact that they have high aspirations. Who knows if that will happen, but I'm looking forward to it. We've done about 175 mainstream, national, regional, and local media publications. If you do a search on Google for Grand Portage moose, you will find as many as you feel like reading. I work a lot with students, with grad students, and so we've produced 2 Ph.D. dissertations to date, 6 masters, now 7, 8 masters of science. We just had 2 defend this summer. 8 masters of science degrees. I write grants to support all of this work. We've generated about $15 million in grant funds, which funds the majority of this work. But that's a pretty significant investment from a tiny tribe in the middle of nowhere. to try to restore a single species. What we have seen, this is the important part, right? We've seen a stabilization of the ground portage moose population through some of our management efforts, so it appears that they are not declining. I'd like to see that trend move upwards. And we are definitely improving Indigenous co-stewardship of moose in Minnesota with state and federal agencies. I'll give a couple examples. So here's a summary of the wildlife work that we do. We collar all of these species because all of these species affect moose in different ways. So the moose are the sort of the main character, but deer affect. If it's for me, tell her I'm busy. I'm free later. So we've caught about 500 moose. Deer carry a parasite that can be transmitted to moose called brainworm. So we've collared about 160 deer to date. We've collared about 140 wolves. Wolves are major predators on moose calves, and so are black bears. So we collar all of these to look at how these four species interact on the landscape and to see and consider if there are management things that we can do to help to maintain moose on the landscape.
Hey Seth, how prevalent is the brainworm? And you said you got 160 whitetails.
Okay, good question. So I'll give you two answers to that. So brainworm is found in about 80% of deer in the Midwest. So almost all deer have it. On average, they have between 2 and 7 worms, and if you crack open a deer's cranium, you'll see them on the surface between the skull and the surface of the brain. They don't affect the meat, they don't affect the deer at all. It's kind of neat. And then, how serious is it for moose? In the first part of our study, about 30% of collared moose that died were positive with brainworm. So
what's the transmission process?
Cool question, and actually I'll talk about that, so that's good. So the transmission is amazing. So what happens is the brainworm lives in the deer brain and it's shedding eggs pretty much constantly. The eggs end up hatching in the deer's intestinal tract, and they're what's called stage L1 larvae in deer feces. Okay, so you're still thinking, well, how does a deer feces with brainworm larvae get into a moose? What happens is snails and slugs eat the feces. The brainworm larvae burrow into snails and slugs, and then both moose and deer inadvertently consume snails and slugs while they're browsing. So they don't even seek them out. It seems completely improbable, but 90-some% of deer fawns are positive for brainworm. So within their first year of life, they are eating high enough numbers of snails and slugs that they're getting this larvae. So, and most parasite life cycles are fascinating like that. So it's just a cool thing to look into is how do parasites get transmitted. Good question. So what do we know right now? We know that there are climate impacts to moose in Minnesota. Deer and brainworm have been the leading cause of adult mortality in moose, followed by predation on calves. So the predation on adult moose is relatively limited. We have wolves, we have bears. Bears don't prey on adult moose at all. Wolves will opportunistically prey on adult moose, but they hammer the calves in spring. Moose are born at a time when, first of all, it's before deer fawns are born, and it's a time when deer are highly mobile because there's hardly any snow on the landscape. So moose calves are extremely easy for wolves to prey on. We know that winter ticks are a major factor in adult moose mortality. About 20% of our moose that die from consequences of very high levels of winter ticks. And then habitat in this area is limiting, partly because timber prices are low, and partly because of fire suppression efforts, but our forest age structure is just a little bit too old to be good for moose. That's the reality of it. And I know, a lot of people don't like the idea of landscape scale fire, but that's how moose habitat was created historically, and I'm certainly an advocate for wildfire myself. maybe semi-wildfire even.
Yeah.
So what do we know? We know Deer cause up to about 30% of annual adult mortality from brainworm, but also deer support higher wolf populations, so then you just get a higher encounter rate and a higher predation rate on calves in the spring. Winter ticks can cause very high annual mortality, especially following the years where we have warm springs. I didn't really talk much about the winter tick life cycle, but winter ticks drop off in early spring, usually from February to April. And if they drop off onto deep snow, typically they drown. That's the population mediating factor for winter ticks. But when we have early snow melt, when the winter ticks drop off, their populations explode, and we'll see sometimes as many as 100,000 winter ticks on a moose. And if you see moose in the area that are missing lots of hair, it's not because they have a hairstyle like mine, it's because of the winter ticks. Wolves can and do have a significant population level impact on moose calves. And we studied this for several years, looking at collaring calves and seeing what their fate was. And the majority of moose calves are dead within 2 weeks of life. They were preyed on either by bears and wolves. In our area in Grand Portage, this predation rate was almost equal, but we have started some early spring bear hunting and have been able to reduce the predation rate on calves by bears. If wolves come off the endangered species list and Minnesota chooses to have a wolf harvest, I do think we may see a little bit of a recovery in moose calves, just because their populations are quite high currently.
How does that fit culturally?
Yeah, awesome
with
question.
wolf harvest?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most tribes in the region generally are opposed to wolf hunting and trapping currently. And the argument is that wolves are a brother of the indigenous people.
Say that again, they're what?
The brother of indigenous people. And you know, my view as a wildlife biologist is I think this is more of a modern interpretation of a Chippewa worldview. And if you look back, you can see headdresses made of wolves by Chippewa people. They clearly were used for fur in the past, and I mean, you have to do that if you have to survive. So how does that all tie into what we do moving forward? I don't know. Grand Portage is less polarized on the wolf protectionism as, say, some of the Wisconsin tribes and some of the Michigan tribes. Why? We've always had very high densities of wolves. We have a high level of predation on domestic dogs and domestic cats, you know, being taken off of leashes. So I think Grand Portage is not quite as strongly pro-wolf as some tribes, but it's a great question. I think about the philosophy of this all the time. Yeah.
Do the winter ticks affect wolves or only wolves?
No. So that's an interesting thing. So moose and winter ticks are what's the word? It's a parasitic relationship that's almost exclusive to moose and winter ticks. So the whole population of ticks is on moose during the winter. The males and the females, the females become engorged and then ultimately lay eggs. No other species up here is really affected by winter ticks. Deer can groom them off effectively. They don't affect wolves at all. Sometimes you'll see wood ticks or dog ticks or deer ticks on wolves, but never high numbers. So yeah, it's just a moose winter tick dynamic for those. And then I mentioned habitat and quality habitat is limiting, and I explained why. It's because our forest age structure just isn't very conducive to moose. So I'll talk a little bit about the expansion. We'll talk a little bit about policy, recognizing that's probably not the most exciting thing for some people. I've gotten excited about it at this stage in my career. But there's been a significant expansion of this recognition of Indigenous stewardship in both state and federal policy. A couple examples. There's an Executive Order 13175 that insists that the federal governments must consult with tribal governments. In the last administration, there was this Co-Stewardship Secretarial Order 3403. It was a secretarial order by both Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture that decisions relating to federal stewardships of lands, waters, and wildlife must include consideration of treaty, spiritual, subsistence, and cultural interests of tribes. This is huge. This means that the tribes previously had a disproportionately loud voice in land management. That has been supported through policy as well, which is pretty cool. It also directs those departments of Interior and Agriculture to facilitate co-stewardship agreements with tribes to collaborate. And I'll give a couple examples of how Grand Portage is participating in some federal co-stewardship. How many locals we have here?
What's the question?
How many locals?
Well, seasonal.
Anybody know who this is? That's Norman. Yeah, that's Norman Shaw. He was the tribal chair for Grand Portage for almost 30 years. And he was the tribal chair when I got hired. And I was fortunate that I was able to work closely with him. So a lot of, I guess he was a great mentor to me, is the best way to put it. So in the secretarial order, the goals were to return management back to the tribes of tribal lands, partly to build capacity. Eventually, I think we would see some dedicated funding, and importantly, this implementation of this 7th generation planning philosophy.
Could you explain what that picture was in Morrisville, what was happening?
Oh, sure. That moose was harvested
Okay.
by a couple tribal hunters. This is Norman and his daughter Tina. And interestingly, this was actually one of our collared moose that Norman harvested. So I came out and did a necropsy on it. Cause of death was a cute lead poisoning. In last year, I mentioned we have some peer-reviewed publications. Last year, I published a paper with some co-authors on federal co-stewardship of North American moose. And what we did was we hosted a workshop at the North American Moose Conference. We had 145 participants from state, federal agencies, NGOs, some members of the public, tribal members. And we did a whole workshop on co-stewardship of moose through an indigenous perspective. And as part of the paper, we developed these core principles of indigenous co-stewardship. The first of which is recognizing indigenous sovereignty. And this is poorly understood in modern society, but tribal nations in the U.S., and in particular the ones that are federally recognized through treaties with the federal government, are sovereign nations. They have a peer-to-peer relationship with the federal government, but they are sovereign in every way, every shape and form. And that needs to be fully recognized by the other federal and state management agencies. There's a shared responsibility to steward resources, and that's because of these treaty rights. Grand Portage has rights to 5 million acres of northeastern Minnesota. It's in the tribe's best interest and in the state's best interest to steward these things in a shared manner. There's this idea of cultural and ecological respect. And I talked about these philosophies, these different philosophies of manifest destiny versus 7th generation planning. And I think if we integrated a little bit more of the 7th generation planning type of approach into governance, we might be in a better place and might actually have something for our kids to subsist on in the future.
You're so polite.
I try to be as apolitical as possible. I'm not very good at it. Again, some more of these are the last 3 of these core principles, but this idea of inclusive decision making, co-stewardship requires inclusive and equitable decision making with the indigenous nations that are also rightful owners and occupants of this land. There's this idea of resource sharing and capacity building. All agencies, federal, state, and tribal, are capacity and staff limited currently. Here's an interesting little tidbit that I think about. In Grand Portage, we have about 250 or 300 residences and a population of about 500, give or take. We have about 50 people working in our natural resources agency. That's about 10% of the population. Think about if that statistic were carried across to North America or the United States. If we had 10% of our population working in natural resources, that would be pretty amazing in my opinion. We're nowhere near that. There are definitely unrealized opportunities in indigenous stewardship. We can form and develop new relationships and partnerships. There are new and expanding constituencies and perceptions. Something that's interesting, here in northeastern Minnesota, is the folks that we get to work with. We can work with the feds, we can work with the states, we can work with Nature Conservancy, Isaac Walton League. There's no specific advocacy group for moose. Interestingly, in northeastern Minnesota, that's probably something ripe to be developed. We can identify communication and collaborative models and make sure that those work. And there are resources available, despite the staff limitations and the funding limitations. Working collaboratively can be pretty effective. So Grand Portage has been a leader in co-stewardship. Right now, the Grand Portage has been working with the Grand Portage National Monument, which is a National Park Service entity since 1999. We actually have one of our employees that are here at the laser pointer on her. So she works in the archaeology and cultural resources part of Grand Portage National Monument. So go see the monument and ask her some questions someday. We've been working with a co-stewardship agreement between Grand Portage and the Superior National Forest that was developed in 2023. I've been working with Isle Royale National Park, which we call Minong, in Grand Portage since 2019. I helped them with moose collaring and wolf collaring and some fisheries work as well. I think we've collared 75 moose on Isle Royale from 2019 to present.
Why does it say pending?
Oh, the actual formal co-stewardship agreement is pending. So we've drafted one. There's been some back and forth between the National Park Service and the Grand Portage Tribal Council, but it's not been finalized yet, and I really would like to see it finalized. But, there are politics involved. Tribal politics can be complex sometimes. I have an interesting co-stewardship arrangement with the National Park Service's Wildlife Health Branch. I have a whole slide on that. And we basically are working with them to be our veterinarians on record for all of the moose collaring and wolf collaring that we do. And then I have a new project that we're just starting now with the Minnesota DNR and the 1854 Treaty Authority that's being funded by LCCMR. If anybody in Minnesota is familiar with that, it's lottery ticket proceeds, about $105 million this year, that go to natural resources and environmental projects. So what do we know? What do we need to know? I think in terms of applied research. So I like to study things, but I always am studying things with an eye for what can we do about it to resolve the problem. So what restoration measures will be effective? Does that mean maintaining deer populations at fairly low densities in core moose range? Does that mean potentially managing wolves to some level lower than they are currently if they come off the endangered species list? One thing you'll notice is I am neither pro-wolf or anti-wolf. I feel the same about most species. I definitely have an affinity for moose. But other than moose, I don't have many biases. And I do think the whole debate over wolf populations is a contrived and highly polarized debate that doesn't necessarily need to be polarized. A wildlife biologist in managing a population manages that population at societal goals. And so that can be done in a sustainable manner. Even if we choose to have a wolf hunting and trapping season, that doesn't mean that there's an intent to decimate wolves or to extirpate them. How can we improve on the indigenization of wildlife conservation? And that's this field that I work in with tribes and natural resources management. And are the challenges to moose global? Are we seeing global changes to moose populations, or are they local? I think there's a good argument that they're actually global. Like I said, I've been working on Minong, or Isle Royale National Park, since about 2018. Our tribe assisted them with translocating some wolves to the island. They were concerned that their wolf population had dropped to 2 highly inbred animals and the population was going to crash. Their concern for moose was the moose population would explode and then ultimately impact the vegetative ecosystem out there. We were actually opposed to that translocation And I sat in a tribal council meeting with Norman Deschamps and our council members, and at the time Phyllis Green, and we made a case that even though we were philosophically opposed to this wolf translocation, we would be active participants in it. And that way the park would better respect our perspectives as natural resources managers in the future. I've been working with them since that time, and it's absolutely becoming, it's playing out the way we hoped that it would. That our perspectives are understood, they engage with us prior to doing things, we have thoughtful conversations and meaningful consultation. So when we did that summer, I think in Grand Portage we caught about 22 wolves during that collaring period. We brought 4 to Minong, 1 left on an ice bridge shortly after. Didn't like that place. And we started the moose collaring work in Iowa at the same time in 2019. And we try to do that annually unless conditions disallow that.
Wait, you skipped that very last part of that slide.
Yeah, sometimes I do that. I just kind of get ahead of myself.
That sounds like success.
What's that?
It sounds like success.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the moose are pretty easy to get. We collar wolves a couple times a year on Isle Royal. We try to get out there in May before there's any visitors, and we'll do leg hole trapping and collaring. And then during our winter helicopter work with moose, we usually dart a few wolves as well and collar them that way as well. Wolves are difficult, whether it's from a helicopter or whether you're trying to trap them. They are intelligent creatures, so it's not easy to get high numbers of wolves.
Have you been able to see the impact now of the translocation? I mean, how many packs are out there, and is it doing what the hope?
Oh, I think it's doing more than what the park hoped for. Yeah, the moose population estimate from our survey this year was about 500 animals, down from 1,500. So it's dropped by more than 50% in 3 years. The wolf population was as high as 50 animals last summer. I don't know where it is now. So, you know, when you start messing around with nature, you don't know what's going to happen.
But the ebb and flow, I mean, if they're dependent on each other, it's a natural.
Yes, I agree. I would think that the wolf population will start to manage itself. They looked pretty lean last year when we were out there. Beaver population on the island has dropped at least as significantly as the moose population. So there's very little food out there other than adult moose, which are difficult. So as the wolves become leaner, there will be more aggression among packs. The wolf population will drop. That will allow a release on moose calves. So we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. It's fascinating to watch it.
Why was the tribe opposed to the translocation?
We meaning I work with our tribal council. There was a 50-year study looking at the dynamics of moose and wolves on Isle Royal. And the thesis of the story, this climate change science, was that because of the reduction in ice bridges, the wolf population would become too inbred and would crash. The moose population would explode, there would be impact to the vegetation. We didn't allow that project to become complete before we intervened. And so we'll never know the truth of that outcome because there were still ice bridges being formed, there still are. And so the scientific argument that I used was we don't have to say that we shouldn't restock wolves ever, but I do think we should allow the consequences of this ecosystem to play out first so that we have a very good and very compelling story about why we need to intervene. And so I wrote a 5-page letter that our tribal chair signed off on. That's my role. I'm an advisor to the tribal council. So
Where you see it play out, what kind of time frame were you thinking?
I was thinking a decade, right? Those last 2 wolves would be dead in a year or so, and you would see a moose population response fairly quickly. You might start to see a vegetative response, but it also allows for a thoughtful evaluation of how do you want to move forward. You know, does the park want to maintain a wilderness ethic where they don't intervene whatsoever? That's been their philosophy up until, the last few years, right? And this is wilderness, we don't do any management whatsoever. And then with the elk and wolf work in Yellowstone and now this work here, we started meddling a little bit more. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I think it should be done in a thoughtful manner. And I think that was more of an emotional play this drama between the wolf and the moose dynamic, and the wolves are going to go extinct on the island. We need to do something now. We didn't need to do something now. We just chose to. Good question. I'll teach you to ask about the last bullet. Yeah, this is a neat one. So I'm working with National Park Service's Wildlife Health Ranch. I can't remember what they're called now. And we started that around the time in which this wolf translocation started. But wildlife biologists, when they do collaring work, if they use anesthetic drugs to immobilize wildlife, you have to have a veterinarian on record to ensure that animal welfare standards are being met. So I have a DEA license. I'm allowed to possess all sorts of opioids to collar moose with, but they have to be prescribed to me through a veterinarian. And so there are not a lot of wildlife veterinarians in this world. I bet there's less than 20 in the United States. And so this was a really interesting opportunity to work with the National Park Service Wildlife Veterinarian Group. They have 3 of those about 20 in the country. They're all just outstanding people, very thoughtful. And so we started working with NPS. Their Park Service, their veterinarian is now our veterinarian on record. We're trying to train in. There's one Indigenous veterinary student who's about halfway through his veterinary degree. We're going to try to bring him in for some Ph.D. work, and hopefully he will be the first Indigenous wildlife veterinarian in the country. So there's some really neat opportunities working with that group.
Is there any study on what, I'll use the word tranquilization, but when an animal is immobilized like that, what's the mortality rate on that group of animals versus those that were never tranquilized?
Yeah, so the way we measure that in our field is what is called post-capture mortality window. So we will label anything that dies within 2 weeks of capture as potentially capture-related mortality. It's not always the case, right? You've got a dying moose population. Some proportion of that population is dying every single day, so you're going to catch some unhealthy animals. Arguably, unhealthy animals might be easier to catch with a helicopter. They're not as spry. So that's how we evaluate that. It's impossible really to, I guess we could do some studies with previously collared animals from the year prior versus animals collared in a given year and look at mortality rates among those and say, okay, animals collared in the current year have this rate of mortality as compared with animals collared in the previous year.
Might that outcome then influence future decisions?
Oh, it absolutely would. And we have enough data now with 500 animals, we could actually start to look at that. That would be pretty cool. Yeah. It's a good question. I personally don't think that the collaring really sort of impacts them significantly. I think it could. But the way I look at this from a philosophical perspective is, we are collaring a very small subset of the population to understand broadly what's going on with the whole population. And so if you look at human clinical trials for studies, it's exactly the same thing. That's how I justify it. I had some interesting questions from tribal members. There are folks that feel, we're really getting philosophical today. There are folks that feel that collaring may not be respectful to the animals. And my argument to that, my counter argument is what could be more respectful to a species trying to understand what's impacting that species and trying to address it, or just allowing that species to peter off into extinction. So my philosophy is very different than that, but those are all legitimate arguments, and how do you sort those out? It's tough, because there's just so many different perspectives in this world. The last study I think I'll talk about is this newer study with the Minnesota DNR, 1854 Treaty Authority, National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, University of Minnesota. And this is a really cool study because if people are familiar with the past history of relations between tribes and state governments, they can and have been very fraught over time. We are seeing some significant changes that I think are becoming institutionalized in the state of Minnesota. Our current governor has hired a White Earth tribal member as his lieutenant governor, and we've seen extremely significant improvement in how the state works with tribes. So I'm very optimistic. Hopefully that will be institutionalized moving forward. It may not. But this is probably the first project ever where the tribes in 1854 Treaty Authority, which is an intertribal, our tribe and the DNR are collaborating as equals on a pretty large project. And basically the goal of this project is really to look at moose yearlings. It's a completely unstudied segment of the population. All of the past work has either been neonates, which are newly born calves, or adults. But the next bottleneck to recruitment are these calves that have made it through their first growing season. And so the goal of this study is to understand what rate are they dying at and what are the drivers of that. And then is there anything, of course, that we can do about it. So we're going to catch 80 moose yearlings per year for 3 years. We're targeting mostly females, and that's because we want to see what age do they first become pregnant. Is it year 2 when they're age 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? It's somewhere in that range. But I think it'll be useful to know that, because then we'll be able to do better population projections. When we know we have a good recruitment year, we can say, okay, it's likely we're going to have good calf production this many years following a good recruitment year.
Can you explain recruitment again,
Yeah,
please?
I apologize. It's such a common term for biologists, and it's such an uncommon term for everybody else in the world. Recruitment is how many babies make it through babyhood to become juveniles. So when you look at a population of fish, you would have what's called a year class. Sometimes you have a strong year class. And that would be a strong recruitment event, is when you have a strong year class, they all make it through their first year of life. It's the same thing, remember I'm a fisheries scientist first. It's the same exact thing in wildlife populations. You have good fawn production years and bad fawn production years. And so that term of production, if they survive through their first year, is what is known as recruitment. Yeah, there's other biological terms that I'm just casually throwing out. It's one of those things I try to think about for public outreach, but I don't always. And I'll criticize my peers for doing it, and then sometimes I do it myself. We're going to look at, we've just built this relationship looking at progesterone levels, which is a hormone found in pregnancy. We collect blood from all the moose that we collar, and we can look at the serum progesterone levels and determine who's pregnant and who's not. We've just built a relationship between fecal serum or fecal progesterone levels and serum progesterone levels. So now we can passively collect feces from the landscape and look at pregnancy rates in moose. And so that's what we're going to do with these collar juveniles, is collect feces throughout the winter to see if those animals were pregnant, and we don't have to catch them again. And then we have this thermal imagery technology that we're using to estimate populations. And this is what a moose looks like using thermal imagery. It's amazing. And this image was taken from 3,000 feet. The resolution of the thermal imagery is startling. And so that's going to be sort of the new way that we estimate moose populations from the air. Rather than risking your lives in a helicopter at 200 feet above the ground, you can just fly swaths with this thermal imagery and really get a nice estimate.
I read where the waterfall surveys using drones showed a significant higher number of waterfall than could be observed with helicopters.
Yeah, I believe it. The technology in biology is improving dramatically, and that's why I'm such a big fan of collaring. People think collaring might be intrusive, but with one tool, I can look at what habitat this animal has used, what its birth rate is, when it died, how it died, right? I mean, there's just so much information that you would never be able to get with any other tool that, to me, it's a worthwhile trade-off to use it, even though it's fairly.
I need to be quiet, but one more question.
No, that's
My brother and I were talking about this. You've got the research, the collaring data to know when you get a significant winter event, is there a behavior that moose typically exert? I mean, they search out what? What do they do when you get 50 below zero?
It's dense conifer, cedar swamps, spruce, high canopy of spruce. ironically, the places they're using for thermal refugia, this is refuges, for thermal refugia, are, there's no food. I mean, if they're in a big, thick, black spruce forest, there is nothing to eat in the winter. Same thing with cedar. Unlike deer, moose don't eat cedar at all. So I think they're basically just living off of stored nutritional reserves during these long winters. But moose are surprisingly lazy too. You know, I've looked at hundreds of collared animals, and you think that moose range far and wide. They actually don't. They usually will stay in about a 200-yard area, like a diameter of 200 yards, for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. They'll eat everything that can be eaten there. They'll take like a half-mile hike, and then they'll do the same exact thing. So if you find a high density of fresh moose sign, there's a very high likelihood that moose is close and will be there for a little bit of time. So those are good places to hang out. All right, so what are our goals with this study with the state? We want to look at recruitment rates, survival rates, the age at first reproduction. Are these younger cows successfully giving birth, and what are the rates of survival of those calves? And then this will help us, like I said, with moose population modeling. Ultimately, always my goal is to look at what habitat and wildlife management strategies will benefit moose. So if we find moose in one area of the state that appear to be thriving better than another area of the state, we can look at what that habitat is and try to recreate that where we are. I think I'm almost done, guys. Oh yeah. Depends on how many questions I get. I'm the guy in chartreuse. So there are some challenges and some potential solutions for Indigenous co-stewardship. As I mentioned, this is a recurring theme. There's a lack of resources and support for co-stewardship. There are lingering perspectives in the United States about the legitimacy of sovereign tribal nations. This is a foreign concept to me because I've worked for a tribe for 20-some years, but it's not very well understood in most of North America. There are many research and management needs to help to maintain our ecosystem. There are barriers that exist to collaboration for tribal partners. Sometimes it can be very challenging working with academia, for instance. Academics tend to have a publisher perish mentality. Sometimes their work is more focused on how many publications they can crank out rather than doing altruistic and forward-thinking things. I've definitely had plenty of conflict working with academics. I still wander into that trap on occasion. And then there's, in Minnesota and pretty much everywhere, there's a mosaic of land ownership and management priorities and regulation, and there's a lack of consensus. And so sorting all of that out can be problematic as well.
Are there any examples in Canada, in First Nation Indigenous relationships with the Canadian M&R or like what you're modeling here in the US?
It's starting. So the way I look at the Canadian federal and provincial government's relationships with First Nations, they're about 30 years behind where we are in the States. They're sorting out these relationships now, where in the 1980s there were a bunch of court cases in the US that really established the sovereignty of tribes, that the treaties are the law of the land, that treaty law is the supreme law of the land in the US Constitution. If you look at Article 4, Section 6, it states explicitly the treaty law is the supreme law of the land, and any subsequent state or federal policy cannot supersede that. So that level of affirmation hasn't been reached in Canada yet. They'll get there, I think, but they are actually looking to collaborations like ours as models for how to do it. So they're a little bit further behind, but they will catch up quickly, I think. Good question. So, the priority steps, we've got to build trusting relationships. I called this Moosin one day, and I go to Minong every summer around 3rd or 4th week in September and call moose and photograph them. called this one, and I could hear him calling back, at about a mile out, because it was a really, really quiet day. And he's grunting and calling, and he's just taking forever to get to it. I couldn't figure out, what is wrong with this thing? He had thrashed so much brush that he couldn't see it all. And he's just stumbling down the pathway. It's one of my favorite. And it's obviously a very young moose, just young and goofy. I got such a kick out of that.
Say, how did you call him in? What did you use?
Oh, I have a birch bark call, and
Did you bring it today?
I didn't. Oh. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's a good cow call. Yeah. I do it quite a bit, and then this documentary that we're producing currently, I brought those two guys out last summer, and I think we called in 6 or 7. So we got some good imagery. So we need to build trusting relationships. I think science-based and shared moose population co-stewardship hopefully will be how we move forward into the future. We're constantly improving communication and coordination. We need to develop some regional and landscape scale co-stewardship strategies. And this will involve you guys, and I'll explain that in the next slide or so. And we need to have inclusive and equitable engagement of all the constituencies and stakeholders. So part of the reason I asked how many Minnesotans there are in the room is because, a lot of times I'll give talks on climate change, for example, and people say, well, what can I do about it? And I'll tell them, you can turn off your LED lights, but that's not going to do a damn thing at the scale of impact that we need. But what citizens do have the power to do is to engage with their legislators. And you would be shocked at how few people actually engage with their legislators and how powerful that actually is. Think about your local representative for this district. How many people do you think reach out to that person? Almost none, right? So if you reach out, those legislators are working for you. They will listen. So even a small proportion of the population reaching out on particular issues can have enormous impact. And I say that because I work with legislators all the time, making points, writing letters for our tribal chair, and it's amazing to see the impacts just a few written points can have. So right now in Minnesota, there is no legislative or executive level support for broad-scale moose restoration. So what does that mean? For the Minnesota DNR, who has to manage moose, white-tailed deer, black bear, wolves, fur bears, ruffed grouse, snowshoe hares, every single fish species, there is no clear mandate for the DNR to prioritize moose in this region over anything else. And so they get beat up by Minnesota deer hunters population who want high deer densities everywhere in the state, even though this might be core moose range. They get beat up by the bear hunting guides who don't want high harvest rates on bears so that there are plenty of bears for their guided hunters to harvest. They get beat up by every single constituency group. And this is where citizens can have an impact and say, look, if we designate that portion of core moose range within the 1854 ceded territory as a northern boreal ecosystem with moose as the priority managed species, it gives the ability for the DNR to push back at every single angry constituent that doesn't like what they're doing, which is 99% of Minnesota's population dislikes the DNR for some particular reason. So they don't feel confident to move forward in any particular direction because they're getting beaten on by everybody. And that's where legislation can help, working with our legislators to say, we need to designate core moose range. If we care enough about moose to restore them, we need to make that the priority species in this region. So thank you for your future service, guys. I'll help you write the letters if you want. This will require a designation that restoration for moose populations supersedes the management for other species. Does this need to happen everywhere in Minnesota? Of course not. But should it happen in the only place in Minnesota where we have potential for a healthy moose population? I think so. There's lack of financial and personnel resources that can preclude progress. We have fractured managed forests. You know, in this region, we have county forests, we have state forests, we have superior national forests, we have tribal forests. How do you sort out how you're going to manage broadly for a species with 4 different management entities and different priorities? And most forest management agencies are managing forests not for species, they're managing forests for harvest. So their job is to produce harvestable forest. Harvestable forest is not actually very good for most wildlife species. So how do you sort all that out, right? There's lack of an indigenous co-stewardship framework. So I wrote this paper that sort of develops how that could be built. We need indigenous perspective combined with a science-based approach. And this is what I like to do in my position, is sort of merging science and indigenous worldview to the extent that I'm able. There's a requirement for large-scale spatial approaches. You know, we need big habitat made. You know, you make a 40-acre block of young forest, that's not really going to do anything at a population scale. And we need to have continued support for subsistence and non-subsistence moose harvest. I actually think if we had a moose hunting constituency in Minnesota, that would be that advocacy group that we currently lack. So I'm not opposed. I love moose, but I'm not opposed to the harvest of moose. How can we improve this? We can indeed increase the number and frequency of these co-stewardship agreements. We can adopt those core principles of indigenous co-stewardship that I described earlier. We can implement these different secretarial and executive orders. We need to streamline access to funding, mostly federal in my opinion. We need to promote the development of tribal students as well. You know, in my job, one thing I think about a lot is I have staff of up to 17 people working for a tribe. I'm the director, and 1 tribal member with any post-secondary education working in my department. So there's enormous opportunity. We need more tribal kids going into STEM career paths, which is another whole direction that I work in. And we need to get these tribal agencies populated with fully qualified tribal members. That's it. The theme of all the work that I do, I think that science leads to justice, whether it's social justice, environmental justice, climatic justice, or educational justice. We can use science to affect positive change. We can address some of these systemic issues in social and environmental and climatic justice. We need to assist with science literacy and STEM retention. You know, in the United States, there is a strong component of our population that is doing active science bashing, and I think that the burden is on all of us to address that and just not tolerate it, honestly. You'll see people bash, say, natural resources science, and then go to their medical doctor with a medical claim. It's the same exact process that got medical science developed as natural resources science. We're all scientists, and environmental scientists have a more rigorous educational pathway than most medical doctors. And the last part is that applied science can literally change the world. So that's it. I'm happy to take as many more questions as you guys have, because I don't have any obligations.
Thank you.
Lynx sightings?
No.
No.
What's interesting is we are definitely seeing a higher number of bobcat sightings, unquestionably and significantly as well. But I have not seen a lynx. I've seen a few images from this region in the last year or so, but I have not seen one personally in probably 10 years. It just doesn't seem like it's
Yeah, climate change?
Webcams.
Yes, I think those are probably the images, because everybody sends me all this stuff. Yeah, I think this got you the next thing.
Yeah, so I have a question about, is there any suggestions you have about a pathway to prepare more people to do what you're doing?
Yes, I've actually put together a proposal to develop a Tribal Environmental and Natural Resources Institute between our tribe and Isle Royale National Park. And we've begun the programming on that. Right now we're looking for some infrastructure to build 2 dorm facilities, dorm and classroom facilities. I estimate it's going to be somewhere between 10 and 20 million bucks. The grants I typically chase usually for construction or infrastructure. So it's going to have to be a trust or a foundation. But I'm on that pathway. It's a very well fleshed out plan. I'm working with Fond du Lac Community College on this, University of Minnesota, again, National Parks and Lake Superior Foundation, and our Royal National Park. So it's one of these sort of major thematic areas that I'm working on. Good question. Yeah.
You mentioned that you mentored 2 PhD students and eight master's students. Was that in collaboration with the University of Minnesota?
Good question. Let's see. Most are with UMN. I've had one out of Michigan State University and SUNY, Syracuse, whatever the SUNY stands for, New York. And then we just finished one out of South Dakota State University as well. So, but the bulk is definitely University of Minnesota.
And to your comment on science, I've had an academic career for 45 years.
Yeah, I figured I'd offend at least somebody.
It's always been tough.
Yeah.
But right now, it's virtually impossible.
Yeah.
The situation is just so grim.
The whole paradigm needs to shift from this sort of publish or perish mentality, which fosters narcissism, right? I mean, it's literally, the more you individually publish, the more you get recognized and the more accolades you get and the more advancement you get. So it fosters absolute narcissism, and there needs to be recognition and reward for doing altruistic work, for serving entities other than oneself. And that's just not how the reward system is in academia yet. Hopefully we'll get there. I have actually put together a presentation for vice presidents of research for academic institutions because I have a 45-minute rant on this exact subject.
I was wondering, with breeding in buffalo, how does that, or has it had any effect on
A moose?
moose?
No.
Buffalo?
Yeah, good question. So I actually co-manage our bison ranch as well, but that's a facility that's completely fenced in. They're not free range. There's never been any intent to have them free range. So the idea with that is really to provide local, sustainable, nutritious meat for the tribe. It's literally the same quality meat as one would get off a moose, so it can sort of help to subsidize moose meat while moose populations are low. But good question. Yeah.
Well, back in the early 70s, college was a new science center.
Yeah.
You had the typical population curve that starts off low, grows real slowly,
Yep.
and suddenly it takes off.
Yeah.
Something happens.
Crashes.
The flag crashes again.
Yeah.
Like when the moose population crashed or dropped considerably several years ago, was there too much angst involved with the drop? That was just part of the normal?
Yeah, such a good question. Such a good question. I had a colleague, he and I would debate this all the time, and his argument was moose exceeded their carrying capacity and have moved back to where their carrying capacity is. So he had that exact argument that while we liked having 8,000 moose in the state of Minnesota, that may not necessarily have been healthy, and the habitat quality that we have currently might not be able to sustain a population of 8,000 moose. There's probably something to that. My argument sort of now, 10 years later, is I would like to see more quality habitat so that we can see if the carrying capacity for moose is actually higher than 4,000 animals. It's absolutely a fair question, and definitely something biologists debate among themselves as well.
I was wondering about how beavers manage their ecosystem and the environment and what kind of effect that has on this population.
Yeah, good question. I like this idea that beavers are producing wetlands and that moose are beneficiaries of beaver wetlands, but it doesn't seem to play out with our GPS data. So people have this perception that moose are sort of semi-aquatic animals, but they really are mostly terrestrial, and there's just very limited windows of time when they use aquatic ecosystems. So locals here will tell you when they see moose. They see moose first week of June in wetlands. Why? The black flies are insane. So they're actually, it's fly avoidance and a little bit of mineral that they can get from aquatic vegetation That's why the moose are in the wetlands at that particular time of year. And then they just, as you move into July, they just seem to fade off of the wetlands. But the other thing I think about is where can you see a long distance and potentially see a moose? You can see a long distance in a clear cut, and you can see a long distance in a lake or a wetland system. And so that's where people see moose, and that's where this belief perpetuates that moose are probably more aquatic than they actually are.
Thank you.
You showed us a slide earlier about the range of the moose population in Grand Portage. I'm wondering if you could tell us what the latest numbers are.
Oh yeah. So our population estimate last year was the second highest in recorded history. And I think that's partly because we had been doing some of this spring bear hunt, which we saw a 40% increase in calf production just by managing a single of the two predator species. So I think that made a difference. And then we've been really active in some forestry projects, and the state has as well, adjacent to the reservation. The Swamp River area has been getting harvested quite a bit. And maybe some of that's national forest, Superior National Forest too, but there's been a lot of habitat work done adjacent to the reservation. So I think we're seeing this sort of combined impacts of some newer habitat and perhaps a little bit related to the bear predation too.
So does the fact that Ontario has a spring bear hunt have an impact on their moose population?
Yeah, that's right. They just resumed it. That's interesting. I would think so. Because at least in our region, bears were about half of the predation mortality of the calves. And that's right, I did hear that Ontario resumed their spring bear hunt recently.
So what's your sense about the population of moose in Western Ontario compared to what you see in
is Western Ontario this area near us? Okay, yeah, it's very similar. So they too have seen a very significant population decline. Perhaps even more stark than ours, but that's because for a long time they were issuing calf tags to every single hunter that applied. So in addition to all this predation mortality early on, more calves were just getting harvested as well. The other thing that's interesting about the Canadian moose survey work is they only assess the population every 5 years. So they weren't seeing the steady state of decline. They would do a survey, and then 5 years later, they're like, oh my word, what happened? So they have now reached a state of concern that's similar to ours. I have a colleague, Brent Patterson, who's doing a bunch of collaring work in Ontario, just across the border from us, but also the same thing. He's collaring moose, bear, wolves, and deer. He's basically sort of emulating the same approach to work that we've done. Which is
you see habitat changes. Is there any migratory impact to moose population? In other words, you're working on habitat in the Grand Portage area, but I'm thinking of the Ham Lake fire. So now you've got that habitat, significant change.
Yeah.
Is there a migration?
We think there may be some source sink dynamics, which is what we call basically, if you produce a great big bait pile of good habitat, you probably will see some moving in from other areas, and that may have played into some of the declines that you see in some areas also. It's a good question. I don't think it's been very well studied.
Well, I was just thinking about your significant improvement in the animals, and your
we could
have been you know, animals moving in because of that.
Absolutely. So it could just be sort of misleading. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, emigration and immigration to areas are these variables you can never have a good understanding of, and so it's hard for biologists to tease that out. Absolutely valid.
And I'm surprised to hear that we don't have a moose advocacy group.
Yeah, there was, we call her the Crazy Cupcake Lady. There was a woman about 15 years ago that started selling cupcakes to, she had a bakery or something, started selling cupcakes to put into moose research. She kind of faded away, and then there's not been one developed since. So we have individuals that are interested,
right,
but we haven't sort of gotten to that level where there's a strong advocacy. And there's, you know, what would the constituency be? Resort owners, tourists, like
or hunters.
Yeah, hopefully, but there's no hunting.
I know right now,
yeah.
but that, you know, you need to support future.
I do, and the state supports that as well. The state would like to see it because they realize one of the consequences of not having legal hunting for moose is that there is no real constituency. Yeah.
You used to be on WTIP regularly.
I did.
And that's how I heard about it.
Yeah.
Years ago. And so many people listen to it, and that's just lovely.
I know. I haven't done it in a while. I'll be honest, giving presentations and public speaking is energetically consuming because I am a writer and a speaker. So every word that I say is being written before I say it. That's why I look at the ceiling. That's where it's all written. And so I found doing this on a bi-weekly basis was just a little bit exhausting. And so I kind of faded out. I've hired a couple of new biologists, and I was thinking about getting hold of Callie and seeing if maybe we could kind of divvy that up amongst the three of us. Because I agree, it was very, very valuable. And I actually enjoyed it. I had a couple really good interviewers, Martha Minchak and Joe Friedrichs and Kara Thomas before that. But always very thoughtful and interesting conversations. But I do sometimes just get overwhelmed with media stuff and get fatigued a little bit, to be honest.
Even once a month would be.
Yeah, agreed. No, it's good. It's good feedback. I agree with you. Yeah.
Any mountain lion sightings?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I get reports and images all the time. Some of the images are a domestic cat walking very close to a trail. I have seen, so of verified ones, there were a couple definite mountain lion images up in the Nebing area just across the border. So it's maybe 20 minutes north of Grand Portage on Highway 61. Those were absolutely certain. But in the 20 years I've been here, I could probably count on a couple of fingers of absolute certain mountain lions. I do think they come through. But the other thing to think about is, mountain lion cubs are only about $200. And the Highway 35 corridor is a known wildlife trade corridor. What happens is people get these cubs and they keep them for a couple of years and they get tired of finding roadkill to feed them, and then they just ditch them. So sometimes you'll see these mountain lion sightings and the thing looks obese as compared to what a wild animal should look like. Those ones somebody just let that thing go. But in terms of, go ahead.
One more wild one. How about wild pigs?
Yeah, I see that on the radar from both directions, right? Have you guys seen these articles about these Canadian cold-tolerant feral hogs moving south?
Yeah.
And then as our climate gets warmer, we got feral hogs from all the southern states moving north. So we're going to get hybrid vigor in our...
All right, on that note, we're going to wrap up the formal presentation, but if you're all right with it, Seth, people can hang out and ask you some more questions. But yeah, anyway.